Hello, Reformed mythologist Morgan Locke here with a video about Moana 2. See if you can stay with me. There will be spoiler warnings. Let's get into the movie, the mythology, and the Messiah. Now, I wasn't the biggest fan of the first Moana film, and that's brought some shade upon me because apparently the first Moana film was perfect and nothing with it was wrong, especially from certain members of my family who thought that it was perhaps the greatest film Disney had ever made. So starting off with the movie, there were some things I really do like about Moana 2, and that's because I quite like Motunui. I like the Pacific Ocean. I like the islands. I like the sky and the sea, the palm trees and the sand and the dancing. There's a lot about that which is really cool and fun. And so there's something quite nice about being back in Moana's world. It feels like something beautiful to look at. So that's a great part about this film, is that you're returning to a place you'd really like to be. And probably why Disney were considering making a TV show based upon the adventures of Moana, which they decided to scrap once they saw just how successful sequels can be. And so I have no doubt that Moana 2 is going to break $1 billion at the global box office quite easily. But what didn't I like about the movie? The unnecessary addition of comedy sidekicks. Just think about how many comedy sidekicks Moana already had from the first film. Let's go through them. A demigod, a chicken, a pig, and then we get these 3 extra characters who just sit on the boat with her and don't really seem to offer anything. It would have been much nicer to just have one of them, and for Moana or Maui to kind of rub up against them individually. They don't really seem to offer a lot to the story. In terms of new characters who you will fall in love with instantly, Moana has a little sister, and she's gorgeous. And the relationship between Moana and her sister is very tender and very sweet. It actually gives Moana something to, in a way, sacrifice, something to have to give up in order to pursue the greater goal. The sad news is that Lin-Manuel Miranda is not the one writing the songs in Moana 2. And that's quite an obvious, clear flaw with this sequel, where it doesn't quite match up to the brilliance of the first film. The movie struggles a bit with its pacing. As I said, we quite like being on Motunui, and then we want to get going, but they have to do quite a bit of exposition before we get on with the adventure. And that's where there's a middle bit. Those little coconut guys, they're kind of fun. They're back. And then the storytelling gets a bit funky. There was an opportunity. They had an opportunity. It was a golden opportunity to explore what it might be like to trust someone who ought not to be trusted. And the film just didn't really explore that very well. Moana pretty much always makes the right decision. So there's a character issue there. There was a conflict that could have been really helpfully explored. Let's move on to the mythology. Now, it's a fascinating thing as a Reformed mythologist to come across more pop culture examples of mythology. So recently on this channel we did a video on Twilight of the Gods, which was a definitely not family-friendly animated series about Norse mythology that you can find on Netflix if you really want to. Now, that explored how Norse mythology was effectively replaced by Christian mythology, or the Christian theology, the way in which the Christian gospel came to the peoples of Scandinavia and replaced the worship of Odin and Thor and Loki and whatever. And interestingly, you have a similar historical setup in the islands of the Pacific. So again, later than the Vikings were converted to Christianity, you have Christian missionaries going to the South Pacific in the 18th and 19th century, lots of them coming from the UK, in fact. And it is remarkable to see just how profoundly Christianized the Polynesian islands are, or the islands of the South Pacific are. Samoa or Fiji or Vanuatu, or all of these places have several hundred years now of real Christian worship and a strongly established church, very healthy Christian churches in lots of those places. So it's interesting that we're returning to Maui as a demigod within those kind of mythologies, because it feels as though there's parallels between what happened with the Norse gods being replaced by Christ, if you like, and Twilight of the Gods does that very explicitly. But the worship of Maui, the worship of these other deities, isn't so much practiced. And largely the established religion of that part of the world is now deeply Christian. There is an interesting part in the film in which Maui makes a wonderful joke. This isn't a massive spoiler, but you can put on a tiny spoiler alert if you want for this. Let's have a tiny spoiler alert. So Maui says at one point, maybe it was a butt dial, and then says to someone, you're going to need to wait 2,000 years for that. 2,000 years? In 2,000 years after the events of Maui, people will have mobile phones to which they can accidentally call people when their phone is in their pocket. So the events of Moana are taking place canonically at the same time as the events of the earthly life of Jesus the Messiah. That's very interesting. The other thing to say about these kinds of mythologies is that they are developed in an oral tradition. And because of that oral tradition, the stories have a certain elasticity. So they kind of go in different directions, and the legends of Maui, the myths of Maui, are slightly different depending on which island you're on, because their tradition was slightly different. The trickiest thing with that is to try to know what is canonical. What is the myth of Maui? And if we haven't got an agreed one, if it's all open to whatever anyone thinks, then it's seemingly subjective. There are the individual traditions, but there's no solid, grounded, definable canon of the myth of Maui. Now, in other ancient mythologies, whether it's Greco-Roman mythologies, you've got a few guys who are mythographers who write these things down. So Hesiod writes down the Theogony and gives an account of the Greek gods, how they all connect together. And because that is written, it then becomes a canon. It then becomes something that we can say is the norm of this god, and then you can tell other stories off the back of that. And of course Ovid will do that in Metamorphoses. He's going to engage with the Greek canon and the Greek gods, and he's going to write slightly different stories for the Roman deities. And what happened with the Norse gods was that their myths were again recorded in the prose and the poetic Edda. Now that was very late in kind of the Norse civilization, but again there is something that is written down. It's been codified in a way, and it's not a bad thing because it means that, okay, you can't do anything with this story anymore. It then becomes a good thing because now you can bounce up against that narrative. And it seems to me that one of the things that makes the Christian religion stand out so much in terms of the religions of the world is that it is a religion of the word. It is an inscripturated religion, that people are told to write these things down because then they can be taught and handed on. There is a kind of accuracy to the theology of the Christian gospel. And so you can have heresy in a way, but these other myths don't fit that pattern. They're much more elastic, they're much more plastic, they're much more kind of choose your own adventure, and that you engage with these stories as very kind of fluid things. Now, arguably, when the Christian gospel was being proclaimed in the islands of the South Pacific back in the 18th, 19th centuries, what people were coming to terms with was the idea that the Christian message, the Christian story, the Christian myth, the myth of Jesus was historically definable, that it happened in a particular place at a particular time, and so you can write it down because this is what happened. And so the Apostles' Creed tells us, and C.S. Lewis picks up on this in Myth Became Fact, his brilliant essay which you should read. The Apostles' Creed says Jesus Christ was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, and suffered under Pontius Pilate, under a historic figure, a guy that you will be able to find if you go around digging in the dust and picking up stones and broken pottery. You'll find evidence of the existence of this historic person. And the great thing about the Christian mythos is that it's the mythos which is the logos which lands on planet Earth, and it happened in a particular place. Now, there is an engagement between the heavens and the mythology and the earth and the islands of the South Pacific and Motunui and so on. But it's interesting that that is not written down in the same way that the Christian story is written down in. The gospel writer Luke says, many have taken up the opportunity to write down these things, but I've written these things, he says at the beginning of his gospel, so that you may know what you've been taught, that there is an accuracy, that there is a historical definability to the Christian message. One thing that's interesting about the new characters who are in Moana 2 is that you've got one guy whose job it is to learn the law. And he's the guy who's going to be drawing these pictures. A little bit like Maui's got this depiction of his mythology written onto him, drawn onto his flesh in his tattoos, that this is an opportunity to learn. You can go back to the story and you can find out what to do now. And there is a character who does that, and that's quite cool. I think that's quite exciting that you've got a mythology nerd in the story of Moana. Maybe he's the guy who should have made it onto the boat. Maybe he should be the only person who's on the boat with Moana. So we talked about the movie, we talked about mythology. Now I want to talk about the Messiah. And this brings us to the climax of Moana 2 and the salvation of the people through the actions of the hero. Now, at this point, I will give you a bit more of a spoiler warning, though I can't remember the exact details, so it's going to be a bit gisty. Here's your spoiler warning anyway. So, in order to deal with the storm, the great storm, and in order to bring up the island from the ocean depths, we need the divine Maui to work alongside the human Moana. There is a kind of unipersonality, okay? These two sides, that Maui and Moana, are going to be working together. And that is a deeply Christian idea because the divine and the human meet in the person of Christ. The unipersonality of Christ is that he is both fully divine and fully human. And he is able to do his work of salvation. He is able to effect salvation for the people because he is both fully human and fully divine. And in the climax of the story, when the island is going to be brought up from the sea, they will both work together. Maui will be the divine one who is high and lifted up. And there is a gorgeous shot of him in the midst of this storm, and he is suffering and struggling high up in the cloud. And there's a beautiful moment when Moana just looks up at him and sees him in his suffering, sees him as he is laying aside in some ways his divinity, as his tattoos are being kind of taken from him. She sees him as he is attempting to pull up this island from the sea using his fishhook. You'll remember that's what he does, according to the mythology that has been codified for us by Lin-Manuel Miranda in the first film in a song called You're Welcome. So that's the way the divine is working, but in the way the film actually works, that is insufficient to actually save the day. And so Moana, as the human, will now need to descend, because the curse will only be lifted if a human can step on the island. So therefore, while we had the one who was high and lifted up, that was Maui, we will now have the one who will descend, that is the human who is Moana. She will descend to the depths and she will touch the earth. And in doing so, this is a mega spoiler warning. Mega spoiler. She'll die. Who was expecting that? Moana, you're not supposed to die. But guess what? She comes back to life again. There's a death and resurrection. This is a profoundly Jesus-shaped salvation. She will bring salvation as she dies and is reborn. And then the human who was Moana will now become this sort of exalted human who gets her very own tattoo, which tells the story of what she's done. So the mythos of Moana is going to be written down. It is going to be recorded in her very flesh. That's deep and profound. That's very, very interesting. That is what makes for a good climax to a film. So there you go. Please do remember that media consumption is optional. You are under no obligation to watch movies about Moana, Maui, or mythology. I've been Reformed mythologist Nate Morgan Locke. I'm glad you were here.